So good evening, everyone, and welcome to IPI for a particularly timely conversation on the AU-UN Strategic Partnership. The very week, members of the UN Security Councils and member of the African Union Peace and Security Council are holding their 10th Joint Annual Consultative Meeting. Many of you will also have followed yesterday's open debate on UN-AU cooperation, Chapter 8, Application and the Future of African Peace and Security Architecture across the street. This partnership was a major focus of the 2015 Peace Operation Review, with the HIPO calling for a stronger global regional peace and security partnership to respond to the more challenging crisis of tomorrow. And the AU-UN relationship has been the topic of many conversations lately, not least around the issue of predictable and sustainable funding, which we will no doubt hear about from Dr. Kaberuka. I'm proud to say that IPI has been committed over the years to supporting the policy debate on the AU-UN partnership through research, publishing, and convening. We, IPI, recently hosted a high-level side event on this topic on the margin of the 10-11 of May high-level debate, which featured foreign ministers of Sweden and Egypt, Mr. Ramos Horta, as well as the Deputy Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly. And our latest report on lessons from the AU's experience in Somalia by Walter Lotzi and Paul Williams is available outside as well. Tonight, we are launching another book, Future of African Peace Operations from Janjaweed to Boko Haram, edited by our good friends and partners, Cedric de Kooning, Lina Gillett, and John Cosrud. Copies are available, you saw, just outside for sale. And Cedric will tell us more about the book in a second. I must say also that this event this evening is organized in partnership with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, and the Nordic Africa Institute. So this evening is an opportunity to discuss the next steps in consolidating the AU-UN strategic partnership, which, although often is discussed in the context of peace operations, extends beyond this to regionally led approaches to prevention and peace building. And we're here to discuss as well the principles upon which this partnership is being strengthened. So let me now introduce the excellent panelists we're lucky to have with us this evening. You have their full bios available along with the list of participants tonight. So first, Dr. Cedric de Kooning, Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and Senior Advisor at the African Center of the Constructive Resolution of Dispute Accord will speak. Then we'll have Ambassador Tekeda Alemu, Permanent Representative of Ethiopia to the UN. Then to my left, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, High Representative of the African Union Peace Fund. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for Dr. Monica Juma, we hope will join us anytime, Principal Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade of the Republic of Kenya. And then last but not least, Mr. Gassim Wan, UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. Cedric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Arthur, and thank you so much, everyone, for spending your early evening here with us tonight, and for your interest in this topic. I'm really humbled to share this panel with the colleagues here. I'm just going to take a few minutes to say a few words about the book and to introduce the book to you. And first of all, I would like to say that some of the people here have been involved in some of the work that is being undertaken this week by the High Representative of the African Union for the Peace Fund and his team. I'm an advisor in that team, and I really want to stress that what I'm going to say now is really relating to the work of a team of researchers in this book, so I'm speaking in my personal capacity when it comes to my remarks here tonight. I would also like to acknowledge that we are privileged to have a number of contributors to the book with us here in the room tonight. So first of all, one of the co-editors, Lina Gillett of the Nordic Africa Institute, is here with us. And two of the contributors, Dr. Jide Martins Okeke of the African Union Commission and Dr. Linda Darkwa, who's with the Legon Center for International Affairs in Accra. And that's also really one of the, I would say, characteristics of the book, and one of the objectives of the book was to create an opportunity for an African narrative and African voices about this topic, about the future of African peace operations. And so we really sought to seek African scholars who are knowledgeable and experts in this topic, who have contributed to the book. I want to highlight 3 key messages out of the book. The first being that the African Union has built up significant peace support operations experience of its own over the last decade. And the second one being that we feel that a unique model of African Union peace support operations has emerged and is still emerging. And that has a number of implications. First of all, that we see a growing gap between the reality of peace support operations as they are being undertaken at the moment and the original design of the African Standby Force that was done in 2003, 2004. And one of our recommendations is that there needs to be a review and a rethink of the African Standby Force to adjust it to the current realities of where we are. And also very importantly that the partners who are supporting and working alongside the African Union in a strategic partnership need to understand African Union peace support operations in its own right, as opposed to assuming perhaps that they are some kind of a United Nations or other form of peace operation. And lastly, that the topic of the financing of African Union peace support operations really has important strategic implications, especially the developments that we've seen in the last 18 to 24 months, with the African Union taking a decision to fund 25% of African Union peace and security activities. And I think that will really change over the coming years the way that the African Union approaches and understands peace support operations. And I'll say a few more words about that in my remarks. So first of all, on the issue of growing capacity and experience of African Union peace support operations. Over the last 10 years, we've seen the number of African troops in United Nations peacekeeping grow from approximately 10,000 a decade ago to more than 50,000 now. Currently, as you know, Africa contributes almost 50% of United Nations peacekeeping troops. So a really significant capacity that has been developed and that is being employed have developed over this last couple of years, partly as a result of the African Standby Force and the other initiatives that the African Union has undertaken together with partners to build this capacity. Also, we've seen a number up to a dozen operations that the African Union has undertaken over this period, which means that the African Union has also built up a body of knowledge and experience about operations, about its operations. And we think this is what has contributed largely to this unique model of African peace operations starting to evolve. We think it's important to understand African peace support operations, as I said, in its own right. What are the characteristics of African peace support operations? And this is important because, especially with the United Nations, with the European Union and others who are entering into a strategic partnership with the African Union in order to cooperate in an international peace and security architecture, it's important for those partners to understand the African Union and African Union peace support operations in its own right. Otherwise, the kind of expectations and the kind of support that are being provided are likely to be to not fit with the requirements of the African Union. So I would highlight 4 characteristics that I would say emerge out of our research in the book. And the first one is that we need to see African Union peace operations in the context of a continent acting in its own area, as opposed to many of the other actors in this area who are acting extraterritorially. So this is really more in the context of solidarity, that the African Union is reaching out to its regions, to its member states, and together with the regional economic communities, acting within its own region to secure and secure international peace and security. It means also that there's a very close cooperation with national forces security forces of the country itself. And very often it's about protecting against an insurgency, or it is about stabilization in that context, together with in solidarity with the national authorities. It also means that the type of operations, peace support operations as the African Union prefers to refer to it, is very different from peacekeeping operations. It's very often about stabilization, it's about counterinsurgency, it's about counterterrorism operations. So fundamentally, doctrinally different from United Nations peacekeeping operations. It's also, I would say, part of the characteristics and the reality of African Union peace operations is that it very much takes place in the context of strategic partnerships. It's highly unlikely that the African Union will undertake any peace support operations in Africa where there will not also be a United Nations, a European Union, a presence of a regional economic community. So it's really parallel type of presences and partnerships among all these different actors that need to be taken into account. And as I said earlier, very often in support of or alongside the security forces of a national government. And these relationships with all these other actors are also, in addition to strategic and political, there's very often also support relationships, especially with the United Nations and the European Union. So there's a need for a great degree of flexibility and pragmatism in these operations. And these characteristics I've highlighted, I would say, have three core implications that we need to take into consideration. First of all, I would argue that we need to engage with the African Union and understand the African Union operations on its own terms. It's not some kind of UN peacekeeping operation, and when we interpret the kind of support, when we interpret command and control, when we engage with African Union peace operations, we need to understand how they operate in their own right, in their own reality. I think we need to recognize that significant capacity exists. Of course, more capacity needs to be developed, but significant capacity exists and have been developed, especially at the national level in many African countries. And although more needs to be done, the nature of the relationship is really shifting, or has shifted fundamentally, from a relationship about capacity building to a relationship about strategic partnership. And lastly, seeing that we have these multiple presences of United Nations, African Union, European Union, regional economic communities, member states, all involved in these operations, the issue of strategic coherence becomes extremely important. How do we make sure that all these different actors have a common objective, understand each other's roles, have an understanding of a division of work amongst themselves? And so that dimension becomes very important in order to bring in predictability and reduce tension and potential competition at times between these various actors. And I'll conclude by saying that it may be challenging to find a predictable model or a predictable system of support, but what I think we can seek is a predictable model of partnership. And with what I mean with that is a predictable process where these various partners come together regularly and discuss their roles in each particular case, and more generically and universally, so that there's a general understanding of the need for strategic partnership and what it means in practice, so that whenever a particular case comes up, there's a predictable way of reaching out to each other and finding the right mechanisms that is unique for that particular case. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop with that introduction there. Thank you, Arthur.
Great. Thank you very much, Cedric. So, African Union having built its own experience and the need to engage and understand it in its own term, and you also pointed to the issue of financing as of strategic importance, which I think leads us nicely into the future conversation. I hand over first to Ambassador Alemu.
Thank you, Arthur. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like, first of all, to thank the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the International Peace Institute for the initiative in organizing today's event. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel, along with personalities for whom I have the greatest respect and who happen to be very relevant for the topic to be addressed. Consolidating the AU-UN strategic partnership for effective international peace and security architecture. It is indeed very fitting that we are having this seminar on Africa Day. I hope it will allow us to further the discussion that took place at the Security Council yesterday on the same topic. It has now become self-evident that above and beyond what Chapter 8 of the UN Charter prescribes the mutual dependence of the UN and the AU on each other for effective peace operation has made their partnership indispensable for both. The question of consolidating that partnership is indeed the most critical issue now, particularly as far as Africa's peace and security is concerned. The partnership has indeed become strategic, even though much remains to be done to make the relationship rightfully merit that designation. Not only has the HIPPO report underlined that fact, it was also more or less clear from the statements of many council members yesterday, including from some of the permanent members. Of course, the same strategic aspect of the partnership between the two organizations is going to define the next framework for cooperation between them, which is due to be finalized this year. It is no longer to be limited to capacity building, as Cedric said earlier. The situation has indeed changed, and for the better. Only a few years ago, the discussion on what the partnership between the UN and the AU entailed was quite different, essentially zeroing in on who was on top, even in circumstances when the primary responsibility of the Security Council for International Peace and Security was never put in doubt. I'm sure since our Secretary General Juan and Principal Secretary Monica, who has arrived now, will recall this very well. The following quote from a statement made by a member of the Security Council some time ago would help throw light on the spirit of the time, and I quote, "The Security Council wants and needs to cooperate closely with regional organizations, as demonstrated by our growing collaboration with the African Union over nearly a decade. But such collaboration need to be based upon the exigencies of the issue at hand. And this cooperation cannot be on the basis that the regional organization independently decides the policy and United Nations member states simply bless it and pay for it. There can be no blank check politically or financially," end of quotation. It does not mean that these types of sentiments have disappeared fully. Nonetheless, I believe the tone and the tenor of the discussions have changed, with the gradual realization of the mutual dependency that I referred to earlier. When you listened to several of the Security Council members calling for African ownership and the institutionalization of the partnership between the UN and the AU, there is indeed change. It's also encouraging that the Peace Operations Review fully recognized the significance of the strategic partnership between the United Nations and the African Union. And this was echoed by the Secretary General's implementation report. The review has made important recommendations to enhance the strategic partnership, which need to be implemented on the basis of a set of important principles, including shared responsibility, division of labor, and comparative advantage. The challenge, nonetheless, is when it comes to making the real decisions along this direction. There is a lot of hesitation there. The positive pronouncements that have been made, that we have been hearing, including yesterday, need to translate into concrete action if we really want to promote genuine partnership. There is need for frank dialogue, to have a strategic coherence in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict in Africa. Perhaps no less critical is the need, following the Hippo report and the two other reviews, to accord primacy to politics, to prevention, and more specifically, to make sustaining peace the clarion call for action for peace and security. This is going to require frank, honest, and serious analysis of the potential threat to peace, whether in the economic and development area or with respect to governance. Both the AU and the UN would have to do much more in this area. It would, for instance, be rather odd, if not tragic, if the UN failed to realize that currently there is perhaps a major geopolitical process underway in the Horn of Africa, Arabian Peninsula region, which requires close follow-up. Let me not digress too much and say, of course, there cannot be any dispute that the Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. But when it comes to matters of peace and security in the African continent, taking into account the views and concerns of the African Union is absolutely critical. In this context, the relation between the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council is central to the strategic partnership between the two organizations. The regular interaction between the two councils should go beyond form and serve as a meaningful platform for achieving strategic convergence in dealing with the most pressing peace and security challenges in Africa. This is how we elevate cooperation between the two organizations into a strategic partnership. The three African members of the Security Council have no doubt a key role in serving as a bridge between the two councils and ensure coordination among them. And is very critical not only in advancing African perspective, which demands that a clear message is conveyed, but also in promoting a better coordination and enhancement of relations between the two councils. The strategic partnership also needs to have meaningful impact in addressing the challenge that African Union-led peace support operations authorized by the UN Security Council face in terms of predictable and sustainable financial and logistical support, regarding which we are hopeful that the effort of Dr. Kaberuka would succeed. For instance, the financial situation of AMISOM is unacceptable and something that has to be done as a matter of utmost urgency to address it. It would be unfortunate if we lose the gains made to stabilize Somalia with enormous sacrifices. This is not about Somalia and the region, The situation has serious implications for international peace and security. The African Union is operating on the basis of Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter, and shared responsibility embedded in the strategic partnership entails that the United Nations provides the required support in this regard. To conclude, this is how we think the strategic partnership should evolve, and this certainly requires some level of flexibility and pragmatism to achieve the desired results. I am sure SG1 and Principal Secretary Monica will shed more light on some of the issues that I raised, and it will be further enriched through discussion. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for reminding us of the progress and the road traveled to date, and the hopeful message of the partnership having become strategic indeed, and yet also for the need for encouraging statements to be translated into action with concrete recommendations you made in terms of the interaction between the two councils in particular, and the need to elevate cooperation, but also more specifically on AMISOM. Dr. Kaberuka, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I want to thank the IPI for this invitation and all of you for being here, and to congratulate you on this excellent publication, which I found extremely useful. Because someone like me, who is a complete novice on these issues, I've had to go through a steep learning curve, reading anything and everything on peace operations I can lay my hand on. And I found this book innovative in many ways, and I want to recommend it to people who are here. Now, I've spent the last 10 years as head of Africa's largest financial institution. And before that, I was finance minister of my country. So you would be entitled to ask, so what are you doing here? With all the knowledge on peace operations on this panel, I should be sitting with you, not here. And so I want to limit my comments to just two issues. I'm here because the African Union, at the summit in January, asked me to help with Africa Peace Fund. And so my role is a limited one to try to fulfill that mandate, which I'll explain in a moment. But number two, on a more comprehensive note, as the president of the bank, 10 years ago, very early in my tenure, we had identified some of these new risks on the continent as not simply issues for diplomats. These were issues for investors. These were issues for African citizens. And therefore, it was important that in our understanding of development, we incorporate issues around managing fragile states, post-conflict reconstruction. So we had set up a fund of about $1.2 billion, which was mainly used to help countries pay their debt when they come out of war, reconstruct the economies, build capacities. And so for me, when the AU asked me to help with the fund, I was enthusiastic because I recognize that some of these new risks we face on the continent will mean that as a continent we pay a high price for it in terms of lost investments, in terms of high cost of doing business, and especially when, in the course of my learning, I realized that the United Nations, whose responsibility is to keep the peace in the world, was indeed ill-equipped to handle these crises because it has no mandate to fight Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other nasty situations. But at the same time, I learned that the African Union has been doing an excellent job under difficult conditions, underfunded, undermanned, ready to die, in theaters where blue berets will not go. But also saw something rather surprising, that while there was political support for what the AU was trying to do, the support for what they were doing in money terms was not predictable. It was voluntary. It was ad hoc. Anything which, in the OECD principles, is against best practice. Because in 2005, there's some principles adopted in Paris of how to support poor countries. What are the basic principles? Long-term commitment, predictability, and as far as it can go, minimize the reporting systems, minimize fragmentation. So as I look at the support architecture which AU received, it was exactly the opposite of these principles. But I saw something else, that the support which provided to the AU was being done in a strategic vacuum. Strategic vacuum defined by me as there's no overall strategy, and so there's no exit strategy. And so whoever is providing support can exit at the point of their choice, which is a huge complication. And so how do we get to a system of supporting the AU operations, which all of us agree are necessary, in a manner which is predictable, sustainable, and within a strategic context? So that as people come in, both the AU and the partners know where is the door out, how, when, under what circumstances. And so as we take on these challenges, my colleagues working on the fund, that is a question we're trying to answer. Now, the African leaders at their summit in January in Johannesburg decided that the African Union was too dependent on goodwill. And so they opted to take a decision to fund as much as possible the activities of the Union. The target being 100% of the core administrative budget, 75% of the program budget, and 25% of peace operations. Of course, this has to be done in a context. 25% of what? 7% of what? It means you have to look at the totals as well. And this is what we are trying to do. And so in the next few weeks, what we are doing is to try to re-engineer the fund, which, by the way, exists since a long time, since 1993. So it's nothing new. But try to re-engineer it for the needs of today and tomorrow, in terms of the systems, governance, accountability, and so on. And number two, to try to find resources for the fund, both from within the continent and from partners in Africa and outside, with the aim of having a roadmap which shows how by 2020 the African contribution will be at 25%. Number three, to try to provide a framework which we are discussing here. So if the AU is able to fund its share, and for those operations which the Security Council has accepted, what is the framework in which now the AU and the UN cooperates, which cannot be voluntary or unpredictable? A framework which is binding to both organizations. Now, I would hope that in so doing, the shareholders of the UN and the AU take another look at both organizations. Because if you're looking for a strategic partnership, it's a kind between two bodies with different capabilities. You have to look at how it's a partnership which is based on trust and on mutual accountability. I say mutual accountability. The AU has to be accountable, but so has the UN to be accountable in that framework. So we'll have to articulate that relationship. Under what conditions operations would qualify, what is the process, and what are the accountability governance mechanisms. So I'm hoping all this in the next few weeks, with your help, we can get it done. It is quite difficult, I must admit. I've done a few difficult things in my life, but this one is quite a little of a challenge. But as someone said, maybe that's why it is exciting to do it. But I'll need your support. And as I hear people are talking about how they have new challenges, we are on the edge of something new. Remember the words of this famous English economist, that in a challenge like this one, often the issue is not the fear of embracing new ideas, which we are discussing now, but abandoning old ones. As I listened to the conversations the last few months, there's a lot of return to the old ones. Now, those can carry us so far, and no further, as the HIPPO report mentioned. We'll have to try and embrace new ideas, bearing in mind some of them are risky, but these are risks worth taking, because the alternative would be ghastly to contemplate. So that's what we shall be doing. At the summit in Kigali in July, leaders will have a summit within a summit where they'll be considering funding the union and funding this particular aspect of the union. And then I hope that thereafter, then the conversation with the UN can begin. But I want to end by saying, let us read from history, understand it, but look to the future, because we are now building a relationship for the future. And some of the things we are used to in our comfort zones were okay for the past. They are not okay for now. We'll have to think together what that implies, whether it is in Africa, and I hope, by the way, in other parts of the world as well. I don't envisage that Africa will always be the place where there is these kind of problems. I hope one day it will be a place where every country is stable. But the framework we build must all be relevant, I imagine, for the Middle East, for other parts of the world which may face those challenges. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaberuka, for walking us through the tall order you have in front of you between now and July. And I'm sure there's a lot of interest in the room on the work you do. And as you were talking about the challenge of re-engineering the fund for the needs of today and tomorrow, and looking at the systems of governance and accountability, I couldn't help thinking, and maybe I wasn't the only one in the room, that maybe once you're done with this, you could give us a hand and look at the UN financing and budget processes and systems of governance and accountability.
That is beyond my pay grade.
So now turning to Dr. Monica Juma, welcome, and I think I should say a warm welcome back to IPI, as I know long ago you were with the International Peace Academy, if I'm not wrong. So welcome back again. We're delighted to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and may I begin by saluting you all. Good evening. Good evening. I am Kenyan, and we greet. Every time you meet, you greet. But let me just begin by, first of all, extending my hearty congratulations to Dr. Kaberuka. I could not think of a better person to grapple with this challenge and to give traction to what has been some discussion on a matter that has been quite vexing for a while now. And I want to just make my comment, really, on the imperative of consolidating the AU-UN strategic partnership for effective peace and security, drawing from the work that crystallized in the Prodi report that was that I happen to have been a member of that panel in 2008. You will remember that when the terms of reference of that panel were given, we were supposed to address the vexing challenge of how to mobilize adequate resources, actually, to support peace operations of the African Union that had been mandated by the UN Security Council. And the operative words were that we were supposed to look for ways of finding predictable, sustainable funding while allowing a degree of flexibility that recognizes the comparative advantage of Africa in addressing crisis and conflict on the continent. As soon as we began reflecting on this task, it became apparent that we needed to reflect on the relationship between the African Union and the United Nations, obviously, and that was really the specific grounding in terms of dealing with what appeared to be a technical task, because it's not very difficult to say, you can find money there, you can find money there, but how you get it to work leads you to the relationship, how people are going to relate to one another, how institutions are going to interact, and so forth. And so specifically, we ended up with quite some discussion around the strategic relationship between the councils, but also the relationship between the Secretariat and other institutional mechanisms that make things happen at the operational level. And it is within that context that I want to make my few reflections on this subject. And I want to reflect on three matters. The first one, really to reflect on the whole question around exploring this predictable, sustainable, and flexible funding, which was the mandate. Because ideally, the issue was that, as Dr. Kaberuka has observed and Dr. Tekeda, that increasingly the regional organizations were finding themselves as fast responders, much of it because of the impact of crisis around them. You are forced to do something, and we saw this happening in West Africa. We've seen this happen in the Horn of Africa, and so forth. And so the question really was, how can we support those types of deployment, whether it is in terms of troops or resources or logistic packages and so forth. And as we went on with this task, and as I've indicated, the question of it being politically, inherently a political question became apparent. This was not really a question about the technicality of whether there was resources or not, but it was really a political discussion around whether you could get in, whether you could be the levels of delegation of authority, whether you could take that decision, whether it was an acceptable decision, and whether the whole other question around whether you could be accountable or not. And that led us also to the whole questions of perceptions. A lot of it is driven by perceptions. Is this, can Africa do this? Should Africa do that? Is it acceptable to us that they do this? The question that Tekede was saying, is there a blank check? Can we give them a blank check or not? Are we comfortable with the decisions that they take? Can they take responsible decisions? Are they forcing us to pay for circumstances that we would have rather not paid for? And so the whole area around perception, so that it's not just a relationship where there is an issue around comfort levels as well. Are you comfortable that the African Union will take the right decision when they sit down in Addis, or ECOWAS for that matter? So we really located this whole question around supporting African operations within the larger context of the security and the broad underlying political and strategic issues of the current world. And for us, I think a number of issues emerged from this. First was the normative issue. And I think we need to figure out the normative issue in terms of the understanding that we all share, that the United Nations Security Council has the primacy of maintenance of international peace and security. That becomes a point of contestation Because, are you eating into our forte? Are you not? Can we delegate this authority? Can we not? And it becomes quite a fundamental question, actually, when it comes to whether you can recognize this to be a legitimate engagement of any African or of any regional organizations. But I think it is important that the question about the primacy of the Security Council is discussed as one of the pillars that determines how this relationship evolves. Because you would have to say at what point do you create a division of labor and what does it look like? Is it in terms of decision making or otherwise? Secondly, I think it is also the question around which the Secretariat drive the councils. How do the Secretariat formulate the perception and understanding of particular crisis situations? And I saw when I was in Addis and looking through this from the council in Addis, in the situations where there was constant engagement with the Secretariat in New York, there was a better understanding, and oftentimes you came out with more consensus than when you discussed issues away from each other. So that this question about how often can you technically engage, even as you monitor an evolving situation, an evolving risk level, it helps to create common understanding, to create common standards of measurements, a consensual approach that leads you to the same conclusions, depending on what factors you are all looking at. So technically, the Secretariat, as they drive the definition of the problem and how it shapes up, helps a lot in terms of defining the strategic relationship of the councils and the decision-making there. Thirdly, the whole question around creating a comprehensive African peace and security architecture, which you hear quite often. I mean, when you talk about responding to crisis, oftentimes you're told, there is a comprehensive, we should create a comprehensive response structure all the way from prevention to reconstruction. But I think what doesn't get spoken about is who and how the necessary competencies are created. Because there's a whole range of skill sets and competencies that are required from prevention all the way to reconstruction that are not necessarily the same, but that need to be calibrated in a certain way if you're going to create the right outcomes that you are desiring. But the fundamental question, even though we say this is the full architecture, the range of the architecture, I think what has not been dealt with is how do we create the necessary skill sets in this range of scenarios. And when you look at them, if you are to use the African peace and security architecture, you're probably looking at 5-6 scenarios, all the way from the prevention, all the way to reconstruction. But the discussion never moves further than that in terms of consistently in determining what capabilities are required at every phase and who creates them. So what we have is a situation of different partners, as Dr. Kaberuka was saying, jumping in, depending on, it becomes a cherry-picking thing. And inherent in that, it creates a fragmented system that is very difficult to respond to the crises or risks that we are looking at in the continent. And that links to the whole question around donor coordination. When we were looking at this and we went into Addis, we found within the fund itself, there were close to 22 donors, and one is here. And some were ranging from, a few tens of thousands of dollars to a whole range of others. And they decided, for mine, I will only give people who are being moved from point A to point B, and the other one only pays for food, and the other one can't pay for boots because boots are for people carrying guns. I'm kind of exaggerating for effect, but that is the degree of fragmentation. Now, all these people are calling themselves strategic partners. All of them were partners, but I think the jury is with you about the type and nature of partnership and the value of that partnership. And I think this is why, in terms of just coordination and even the fund, creating a fund that insulates the resources from all this interest, I think would go a long way in terms of creating a pool from which you can draw depending on the capabilities that you are wishing to create. Now, a few observations. I think whereas we keep saying that we need to reaffirm the collective responsibility for global peace and security, I think there is a trend that is occurring today that must cause us concern. And that trend is really the inversion of responsibility, which is generating a trend of benign neglect of crises in some parts of the world. Now, it is interesting to watch the biggest crisis, say in Somalia, because it is near where I come from, or Darfur, or mention another one. You find the most complex and most volatile, most difficult situations have been left to the least capable organizations. And I think this must worry us, because I think I don't know whether it is, I don't think it's deliberate, but I think it translates into some degree of abdication of responsibility. And yet we are beginning this from the premise that it is a shared responsibility, it is a collective responsibility, and that the UN Security Council has responsibility for all crises across the world. So this trend needs to be reversed, in my view. It needs to be reversed, and it is critical that it be reversed. And it can only be reversed through very strong political will, because it has to be determined out of the UN Security Council that, and logic would dictate that the most complicated situations are the ones that attract the UN Security Council. That should really be the logical conclusion. But when you have a crisis like Somalia running in 2.5 decades, where we are really on the cheap, and we are even having people, instead of scaling up, we are scaling down, I don't know what this means. I don't know whether I don't know if we are still calling this a partnership. I don't know what it is. But certainly from where I sit, I think this trend is diminishing. It's diminishing the ability to deal with crises in the world, because it is leaving the most potent crisis to the least capable organizations. And I think this is something we need to reflect on. Secondly, I think partnership needs to take also interest in the fact that there are more countries that are interested in Africa beyond the general desire to deal with instability. In terms of, if you look at business interests, the number of countries that are interested to invest in Africa, that are interested to do business in Africa. And this must come to the table in terms of stabilizing the risk factors for Africa as a matter of obligation. It cannot be that Africa is just a place where you go to do business in risky situations for high returns. I think there has to be, this collective responsibility must also find expression in these types of actors. Now, as we look at the emerging threats to peace and security, I think the point about deploying capable and credible peacekeeping missions cannot be underscored, enough, because the complexity demands greater, not less, responsiveness, as I have indicated. And I think I have made the point that matching capability to the threat levels is key. It's absolutely key because of the dynamic posture that we are seeing in terms of the risks that we are looking today. And this, to my mind, underscores the need to go back to the point that was being made earlier on, that we have to find modalities for having predictable resources that we can deploy in a flexible manner to create the most returns in terms of securing crisis situations. Finally, I think the relationship between the AU and the UN, particularly the both councils, is evolving, but it largely remains ad hoc, in my observation. It is quite ad hoc, and it is not, as has been observed by Dr. Kaberuka, it's not necessarily out of a shared strategic vision. And somewhat that seems to be the starting point. I think it is the starting point, because unless that is done, then the comfort levels will not be there. It will be difficult to share common understanding of what constitutes threats. And we saw that even when we were arguing about Mali and other places where, you're saying don't do this, the other person says we must do this, is the only way out. And in those types of situations, even the value of comparative advantage is lost. It's lost completely, and we all have to deal with the negative consequences as we have seen. So I just want to leave it here and say maybe a bit of work requires to go into reflecting on how to create a strategic visioning that is shared by both councils from a political point of view. And I still underscore that the search for predictable, adequate financing is not just a technical issue. It is a deeply political decision and commitment matter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juma, for sharing some of your experience, both in having served on the Prodi Commission, indeed, and later in Addis, and it's interesting to reflect that. I guess it was 2008, so 7 years later, the HIPPO report still reiterated some of the recommendation that came out of the Prodi report at the time. Thank you also for bringing up some other issues to the table, including the normative issues, the issue of the relationship between the secretariats and the council, so the AU Commission and the council and the UN Secretary and the council. Again, the issue of comprehensive African peace and security architecture, and importantly also the issue of donor behavior, I would say, the issue of earmarkings and so on. So now, moving on, last but not least, Mr. Wan, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. It's of course extremely difficult to take the floor, to be the last to take the floor, because I can just say that much of what I wanted to say has already been said by those who spoke before me and who are extremely well qualified to talk about the partnership between the AU and the UN. And Monica, who is on my right, has not only been a member of the Prodi panel, but the first AU report on the AU-UN partnership was considered by the PSC and her chairmanship. And I remember it was 9 January 2012, indeed, and one of the longest AU communiques, and which bears testimony to the importance of the partnership. But I wanted to maybe just say few, building on what has been said, make few practical remarks. One, on what has been achieved. Second, on why the partnership is an absolute necessity, because at times we tend to look at it as an option. We can partner or not partner. And I believe it's an absolute necessity. And third, where should we go from here? On the first point, what has been achieved, and I'm building on what Dr. Kaberuka said, he referred to old ideas and new ideas. Very easy to embrace new ones, extremely difficult to abandon new ones. Old ones, sorry. Extremely difficult to abandon old ones, indeed. But my contention is that we have already started abandoning the old ideas. And I'll give few examples to demonstrate that, because we really need to see where we came from. 10 years ago, the partnership we have today between the AU and the UN would have been absolutely unthinkable. And a lot of progress has been made, and often I believe we don't celebrate enough what we have been able to achieve in our eagerness to move forward. And indeed, we need to move forward. We need to be more creative. We need to be more flexible, but a lot has been achieved. I give few examples. And building on my own very particular experience, well, today I'm sitting here on behalf of the UN, even though I'm speaking, I would say, on my individual capacity. A few months ago, I was at the AU, also working on this very partnership between the two organizations. Today, the UN is providing support from assessed contribution to an AU-led peace operation, AMISOM. Total amount of about $600 million, or slightly above $600 million. That would have been absolutely unthinkable. And I think one day, one has to write the history of the support package to AMISOM. When it started as an EU request, and no one ever thought that the request would be processed or accepted. It has been accepted, and it has been improved over the years. Last time it was improved with the last resolution on UNSOS, which improved the package based on lessons learned from experience. So I believe it's extremely important. Often in the past, it has been unthinkable for the UN to provide assessed contribution for operations it doesn't control. Today, it's no longer taboo. It has started in Somalia, and efforts are being made to see to which extent it could be expanded to other operations. We have not succeeded in Mali, AFISMA, we have not succeeded in CAR, but the idea is no longer taboo, and it has provided a new impetus to the recommendations of the HIPPO panel to move further and to see to which extent we could systematize that type of arrangement. So this is one element we need to keep in mind. And before that, in Darfur, we had the light and heavy support package towards the end of AMIS and its transformation into a hybrid operation. And that brings me to the second innovation. 15 years or 10 years ago, again, would have never thought that a hybrid AU-UN operation would be in the realm of what is possible in the relationship between the two organizations. We have UNAMID, which has been on the ground for the past 9 years, 2007. And again, it was an absolute taboo. No one would have thought about it. When UNAMID was created, it was created precisely because Sudan was not comfortable with a UN mission, and the AU was not capable of continuing to fund AMIS. And the solution had to be found. People were creative from the UN and from the AU, hence the idea of a hybrid operation. Other examples of a strong and very close working relationship between the two organizations in the area of mediation. Sudan, where the AU is leading a process to which the UN is making a contribution. South Sudan, the UN is running a peacekeeping operation. The AU High Representative for South Sudan, former President Konari, is making a tremendous contribution, working very closely with the United Nations. The cooperation is not only operational, it's also at the level of the two secretariats. We do work together more closely today than we have ever done in the past. We have the joint task force. Of course, we could improve the functioning of the GTF, no doubt about it. We do have the desk-to-desk, which unfortunately has not met for a few years, as far as I could remember. But these are structures that bring together the two secretariats working together. And again, we need to highlight that because often we look at the bottle as being, or the glass as being half empty, and I tend to look at it as being half full and as continuing to be, and I believe that we are in a situation where we are making continuous progress. We do undertake joint missions on the ground. AMISOM, again, where we work together to develop joint CONOPS endorsed by the AUPSC and then transmitted to the United Nations Security Council. I'm going to venture outside my own area of competence in the UN. When I take the area of mediation, I remember in Guinea-Bissau, we did have 2 or 3 joint missions, and I had the privilege of leading 2 of them together with the UN and regional grouping. So the cooperation is really making progress. And today you would see, often we do issue joint statements between the EU and the UN, and we even go further, we bring in regional groupings, ECOWAS, European Union, La Francophonie, to address issues of common concern. So we have made progress, and I would say we have started abandoning old ideas. The challenge now is to abandon them fast and to embrace new ones fast. I think this is a big challenge. Now, this brings me to the second part of my brief presentation. Why this partnership is important. It's not optional. It's an absolute necessity. Neither the UN nor the AU can address the challenges facing them on their own. They need to cooperate together. It's an absolute necessity. Often, and again, I have been in the AU for very long, for over 20 years. I have joined the UN for only 4 months, so I can't claim to know the UN very well, but I pretend to know the AU quite well. I would say often at secretariat level, we tend to behave as if we could do away with the partnership. Hence the need for a cultural change. We have to work together. It's an absolute necessity. And why? There are 3 or 4 sets of reasons. One is that the Africans want to take ownership of peace efforts on their continent. That's a starting point. The whole idea of APSA was to endow Africans with the capacity to deal with their own issues. That's the idea of APSA. And that cannot be ignored. That has to be encouraged. And by the way, the Charter, the United Nations Charter, does encourage regional groupings to address conflicts in their own areas of competence. So it's good. It's a good starting point for the United Nations. An active UN is an asset for the United Nations, which can act directly on its own or act through its own regional arrangement. So the stronger the AU, the stronger the United Nations, the more responsive it would be. The second element is that each of the organizations has its own comparative advantages. Clearly, when we face situations in which there is no peace to be kept, in which you have to fight spoilers, in which you have to tilt the balance in favor of those who want to move forward, in which you need to neutralize armed groups that are trying to disrupt a peace process, a nascent peace process, clearly the EU has a comparative advantage. It has demonstrated it in Somalia, in Mali before, in Central African Republic, and I would even say in Burundi in 2003, because it did deploy a mission for a while before the UN took over. That's a reality, and the reality that the United Nations has acknowledged. The EU can move in fast. The EU can move in situations in which there is no peace to be kept. However, and that's also a reality that the EU does acknowledge, the EU does not have the capacity to sustain its own deployments. And the EU does not have the capacity to undertake the type of multidimensional operation that the United Nations can undertake. This is also a reality we need to acknowledge. And again, I can speak from my own experience. A few years ago, I would have said, oh, we could deploy in CAR, for 3 or 4 years. I would even say, give us the money, we'll be able to do it. To some extent, I would say, well, I have changed. I believe, yes, the EU can deploy in CAR for 9 months, for a year, to somehow create the basic conditions for the UN to take over. But if you want to sustain peace in CAR or in Mali or elsewhere, you need not only military capabilities that are well-run, you need also an extremely developed civilian capability, which the EU doesn't have. You need a funding stream that is predictable, which the EU doesn't have. And hence, the need to combine the two organizations, to combine their respective comparative advantages. But there are other reasons why the partnership is an absolute necessity. The changing nature of conflicts in Africa. We're no longer talking about conflicts between two states. There are few on the continent, but extremely few nowadays. Most of the conflicts are internal. They may not meet the UN threshold of a threat to international peace and security. But in the AU context, in the context of the regional groupings, these situations may warrant external or a third-party intervention. Hence, the need to get the AU acting, the need to get the regional groupings acting, and again, it's the UN acting through its own regional arrangements to do conflict prevention. Third, I believe that we are increasingly realizing it in both the UN and in the AU, that we are strong when we work together, and we are weak when we don't work together. There are a few years ago, probably, that awareness was not there, or at least not sufficiently felt by both organizations. Today, I believe we all understand that. And when you look at the reports of the United Nations Secretary General, and when you look at the report of the HIPPO, the AU has been identified as the main partner of the United Nations. So I think that's why I'm talking about, that's why I'm saying that the old ideas are really being abandoned. But we have to abandon them fast and embrace the new one fast. So what should we do to enhance that partnership? Few ideas. One, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have most of the tools we need to enhance the partnership. We have to implement what has been agreed upon. When I look at the communiques of the joint consultative meetings between the AU Peace and Security Council and the United Nations Security Council, there are a number of good ideas. Joint visit to the grounds, consultations, it has all been agreed upon. Where are we in terms of implementation? And I believe we need to focus our efforts on implementing what has been agreed upon. Second, the issue of funding, as outlined by Dr. Kaberuka, needs to be addressed. And again, it's no longer taboo. The Secretary General, in his report on the HIPPO report, did say that the need for a flexible, innovative, and predictable funding for AU-led peace support operations undertaken with the consent of the Security Council has to be addressed. And we are happy that Dr. Kaberuka has been given this task, and indeed, as you rightly underlined it, Monica, no one could be better placed than Dr. Kaberuka to take up this task. He brings in a wealth of experience that would be extremely important in achieving the goals that have been set. And we look forward, of course, to his report. And I do understand that member states are showing a particular interest to his work. And I'm sure once it is tabled, once it is endorsed by the African Union, I'm sure the necessary support will be mobilized in the larger international community to take this work forward. Third, we need to, in order to enhance the AU-UN partnership, to also look beyond that partnership. There are other actors who are critically important. In the case of Africa, the European Union. And I believe this idea of a trilateral partnership needs to be deepened a bit. The EU brings in expertise. They bring in also a wealth of resources. And they do contribute to the funding of a number of AU operations, including the funding of APSA. And they should somehow be part of this partnership between the AU and the UN if we want to streamline it and to ensure that it's well coordinated with the AU-EU partnership. Last but not least, strong partnership requires strong partners. If the AU wants a strong and innovative partnership with the UN, the AU has to be a strong organization. It means that we, and here I'm talking, we as Africans have to get our acts together. The AU has to become a strong organization. It means its member states have to provide the necessary funding, at least contribute more significantly to the funding of the organization. It means the Africans have to speak with one voice within the Security Council. So it requires a number of acts that the Africans can take on their own if they want to be a strong partner of the United Nations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warren, for all those very concrete recommendations to enhance the partnership, and also for reminding us that the relationship is not only in New York and Addis, but also is very pragmatically on the ground with an absolute necessity to work together. Now, for sake of time, I will turn to the audience, and also because we have, I see, a very expert audience, actually, both on peace operations, but also more generally on the relationship and on African Union as well. So we'll take maybe 3-4 questions first, and then the panelists will be free to pick and choose which one they want to answer. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Thank you. I am Walid from DPKO. I hope you are expecting. Thank you. I am from DPKO here, and I hope you are expecting us to be frank, or else, Are you expecting us to be frank? Facilitator?
Please.
Thank you. I speak from a point of experience on the Somalia file. I've been there since the first bullet was fired in December 1990, to date. And I can tell you that I don't see a partnership. I mean, why? Whomever designed this word was unfair to all of us. This is excessive diplomacy. Partnership is a stage perhaps we will reach, because we find ourselves now, we want to strengthen the partnership. I don't know what will be the next word, if it is really strong and a partnership exists. What is happening now is cooperation, and it's not even structured cooperation. This is the fact. No need to run from it. Point number 2, neither the quote Dr. Takeda reiterated to us, nor the direction that Cedric indicated earlier about the peculiarity or ownership of the AU PSO, peace support operations, is right in my view. I think this is a moment where we want to work together. I think what is going on now is not an attitude of separation, but that of coming together. I think we can qualify African operations today as peculiar in terms of what you said, counterterrorism. But I think overplaying the card of the ownership is counterproductive at this point. I found it very counterproductive. Because we don't pay for it. It's as simple as that in Africa. Believe it or not, I come from Africa. But the point is simple here. We cannot just blow this issue of ownership. We need to stop that as well, to be very fair in our situation. Let me ask you a question. If today every single peace support operation in the AU, let us enjoy the pleasure of imagining the African Union is able to pay for it fully. would we be here today? Would we be seeking a partnership of the caliber that we are trying to define? It's important for me because as much as it is political, as Madame Juma said, yes, it is political. I think, but not everything is coming from political. A political commitment today does not mean flow of resources. We all know that this is a point in time where the money is very important. I don't think it is prudent to say otherwise. The political part of this game maybe is as important, but if we are able to pay, it won't be. So I'm asking you, if today we had the resources necessary, would we really be seeking this relationship? Point number two.
Please,
Yes,
please a question, if you mind, because we don't have that much time, so if we could get a few questions. Thank you, Wally. Appreciate it. Linnea, please. Go ahead. With the microphone, please. Has to be turned on as well. Thanks.
Coming from the Nordic Africa Institute, I want to humbly and very gratefully say thank you so much for IPI for hosting this event and for this ability to co-arrange the event. My question is for Monica Juma, because you mentioned who will have the opportunity to define what skill sets, what competences should be created. And I wanted to hear your view on what are those strategic skill sets that right now are most urgently needed, in your opinion. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, ma'am.
The Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I'm so excited about this financing fund that especially Dr. Kabaruka and Ambassador Juma have been giving us details about. But I wanted to ask you, the UN Peacebuilding Fund was created on the basis of a recommendation from Shep Foreman and his colleagues for what they called a strategic financing facility, which aimed to do exactly the same thing. Do you think that the African Union has learned the lessons of why we didn't get what they knew was possible? And or whether the AU can override the kinds of problems that happened in trying to create that at the UN?
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll add, I'll abuse my right as chair and add one question, building from the ambassador's remark earlier about the importance of a holistic approach that gives primacy to politics and prevention and political solutions, sustaining peace. And I think Monica also mentioned the need for a comprehensive African peace and security architecture. And my question would be, has this issue, beyond peace operations, which is often the focus of the discussion on the relationship, has this broader spectrum been taken up in the discussion on AU-UN partnership? And do you think, is it the right time for renewed cooperation on these subjects as well? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me first respond to Walid's comment. I tend to agree with what you said with respect to partnership. Really, what we see is, yes, no doubt, as one said, there has been improvement. But on the other hand, still, most of the talk is rhetorical. We have not yet established a partnership between more or less equals. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Peace and Security Council of the AU should be on the same level as the Security Council. But in terms of comparative advantages, in terms of proximity, no doubt, the AU plays, say for example in Somalia, without the role of AMISOM, it is doubtful that there would have been the kind of progress that we have been able to make. Therefore, what we see is the Security Council has not begun to take the Peace and Security Council of the AU seriously. Therefore, we can see from the results of the discussion over the last few days, there is a need for major improvement as far as I'm concerned. But then you come to your second comment and said that somehow we focus on ownership too much. I thought you overlooked the fact that there are problems in that area that we face, the challenge with respect to double standard, with respect to respect for principles of international governing interstate relations. The consequences of that are real. And it is very, very important, therefore, for the UN, the Security Council, to take what the AU is saying very seriously. But at the same time, of course, as was said, we need to get our acts together at the AU. This is going to be very important. And that when coming to your question, yes, there is a need for focusing on the political aspect, on prevention, on ensuring that peace would be sustainable. Sustaining peace is absolutely critical. For that to be realized, of course, there is a need for serious discussion, analysis of situations with no holds barred. There is a need to make a major progress in that area, not only on the part of the African Union, individual African countries, but also the AU. In that regard, there is a great need for the DPA to enhance its capacity for analysis of situations. I refer to the fact that at the present time, we see this development in the Horn of Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula, which is a very serious development, which requires serious analysis, serious looking into what is taking place. I don't think this is being done by the UN, unless I'm seriously wrong. Thank you.
Dr. Gabriel, you want to come in?
No, just I'll let one. Sorry. No. Just one point to my brother from Mogadishu. By the way, congratulations. I mean, I wonder how you do that. You know, as an outsider to this, even when you are poor and you don't have the means, ownership is extremely important. I would even say it is extremely important when you own the problem, but you don't have the means. It at least enables you to define clearly the nature of the problem and nature of the solution. The fact that Africans don't have the means should not lead them to think that, okay, they will let other people define what the problem is and what the solution is. I actually would think quite the opposite. Now, having owned the problem, you could say, well, I don't have the means. Can you work together to find the means? But abandoning ownership of a problem on your doors, inside your country, affecting your citizens, would be very, very damaging outcome. Although I can see where you come from, but I do hope that the African Union owns more and more what is happening on the continent, Just before coming here, I was saying that as the president of the bank, I was very hostile to countries increasing their military expenditures beyond 1.1% of GDP. I said I have since changed my mind. I believe that security sector reform in all our countries is now extremely urgent, so that they have the capabilities to deal with things which happen in our theater, often from outside. Now, I'm not saying that military expenditure should explode to 5, 6, 7%, but I was saying to your colleagues that I changed my mind because of Ebola. I saw how Senegal, as Minister Gadio here, was able to deal with Ebola very effectively inside 1 month because they had the minimum capabilities to deal with the virus. And their next door neighbors, without that minimum capabilities, then the virus became a pandemic. So that is one thing I want to say, and which is related to ownership. Now, having the military is not enough. It must be a military with all the attributes of what a military is. That's why I'm emphasizing the importance of security sector reforms. Number two, I really cannot agree with one more what he said about having a strong African Union. But for Minister Gadio is here, so he knows more than I. We set up the African Union early 2000. I think it is time now to take another look at the African Union, especially its funding, its structure, so that indeed there is a partner who can partner with the UN, with the AU. If that did not happen, it will remain a very junior partner in this partnership. Although I think the UN, it's not because I want to reform the UN. I think the UN also has something to look at. So it can become a strong partner as well. Now, very finally, I think that going forward, as we build the fund, it is not a fund only for peacekeeping. I hope in this fund we have a window which has a very strong component of preventive diplomacy, a strong window to ensure that we don't come to peacekeeping. Because once we do that, we shall have few theaters of action where we need cooperation with the UN. Now, we have not yet concluded on the structure of the fund and the windows, but we'll give a lot of emphasis on preventive diplomacy, which of course does not even qualify for the necessary contributions of the UN. That is something different. And then, of course, we'll build strong capabilities in the fund for stabilization missions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If we had money, would we want partnership if we were wealthy? I think yes. I think yes. Because I don't think this partnership should just be about money. I think it should be about understanding the theater in which we find ourselves, the types of threats that are upon us. They are increasingly being transnational. So even if you had money, you would probably need somebody else to have a conversation about how risk X is manifesting from their end. So I think it is not so much the money bit, and oftentimes it is defined in money terms, but it is money and more. I think it is money and more. I just want to reflect a little bit on what one said about need to remember where we have come from and what we have achieved. I think in doing that remembrance, it is important to audit its value, the value of what we call success. Because there is a way in which, and that value must be placed against the scale of the crisis and the fragility we are dealing with. Because when I look at Somalia, and this is where I share my frustration with Walid, it's almost as if we anticipated so little. In fact, we anticipated nothing, so that we've gotten so little, and we are supposed to be so grateful, you know? And I find this problematic from where I sit. The Somali situation is an indictment on what we call international community, really, because it brings together a whole set of threats which, taken discreetly, would constitute, each one of them would constitute a threat to international peace and security. Whether it is in terms of state fragility, whether it is in terms of displacement, the threat of piracy, terrorism, humanitarian crisis, each one of those, it is to such a scale that individually it would constitute a threshold for concern for the United Nations Security Council. So when I place that against what is supposedly the support package, I really feel very disheartened. You know, it is not cheap. It is cheap, you know, and it really cannot do anything. And this is my frustration. When we discussed the first CONOPS on Somalia, it was clear that the troops required were in the upwards of 30,000. We started at 12, and it was such a struggle to get the 12. It was such a struggle. To this date, AMISOM is still a land-based force. It cannot do what it's supposed to do, no matter how much you like it. So I think it is an audit of, it must be an audit of the support package vis-a-vis the threat levels. And if it is not sufficient, it is really not. It is not, you know. You almost feel as if it is tolerable. It's as if Somalia crisis has become tolerable. And I think it's a big indictment on all of us, really, as the international community. What skill sets are needed? I think, well, I am not an expert in skill sets, but I think there's a whole range of skill sets if you were to think about the way from preventive diplomacy that Dr. Kaberuka was referring to here. For me, that begins in the benign area of prevention, even in the management of politics, the management of socioeconomic affairs, the management of competitive politics. This is how fight must begin. And I think there's a whole range of tools there, including the APRM, that begins to point the red flags that you must focus attention on quite earlier on in terms of the way society is organized. And there's a whole set of things there, including the notions about inclusion that will help you, will help the curve not to get skewed either side of the curve. To the questions around management of a crisis when it begins to manifest, whether it is in terms of mediation, the use of special envoys to de-escalate situations, and there's a whole set of skills there that are required. And I don't mean them in the traditional set, the way we have understood this, you know, envoys. Sometimes we need to think innovatively in terms of just some, and I don't like local mechanisms either, because we kind of create a nostalgic kind of thing about how to deal with these things. Huh? So I think we need to look at how do we de-escalate situations? What do we need to do in order that we can contain what could be a potential crisis from blowing into a full-scale crisis? In the event this happens, I mean, this goes on to now deployment and all sorts of things of a whole set of skills, as one was saying, whether these are military or civilian sets of skills. Again, a whole range of things there that can be deployed and skills that can be created, to questions around resolution, the resolution of those conflicts, reconstruction, jump-starting livelihoods, and sometimes it might require us to think beyond the restoration of normalcy. Because oftentimes when you talk about reconstruction, people are just talking about going back to where you were, as though that was not the trigger point for conflict in the first place. So I think some degree of thinking about how do you get a society beyond the trigger points that led them to the crisis in the first place. So I see a whole portfolio of things that require to happen if you're going to intervene at any one of these stages so that you can reduce that conflict from escalating beyond manageable proportions. I think I'm going to leave the question on the Peace Fund to the one that was asked by the lady there, because we have the option to choose.
Well, I should have said I should leave the question to the AU. But all outside. No, but I wanted to, if she could repeat the question, maybe. Could she?
The UN Peace.
At the UN was a proposal by Shep Foreman and his colleagues at NYU, which they called a strategic financing facility. And it was based on precisely the same principles that I've heard from Dr. Kaberuka and Ambassador Juma about the AU fund. I appreciate very much you saying this isn't just about peacekeeping. It failed, but there's some political reasons why it failed. And so what I was curious about, whether people at the AU have taken a look at why it failed so that you can avoid those, or whether you're already beyond it. And that can also not only tell us what you're going to do with the fund, but some of the advantages of the AU in relation to the UN.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I can respond, at least to compare it to the UN Peace Building Fund, but just few points on the EU Peace Fund, which was created way back in 1993 in Cairo, declaration creating the first AU mechanism on conflict prevention, resolution, and management. And then it was integrated as such into the protocol that created the AU Peace and Security Council in July 2002, and I think adopted in Durban in July 2002 and entered into force in December 2003, if my memory serves me well. And the Peace Fund, as defined in the protocol, will say, well, there are two aspects in it. One, you have a mandatory transfer from the AU regular budget to the Peace Fund. Once the EU regular budget is adopted, they top it up by a certain percentage. It used to be 5%, 6%. A decision was taken in Tripoli in August 2009 to bring it to 12%, but never implemented. And currently it should be at 8% of the EU budget, 7 or 8% of the EU budget. And that brings you to a total amount of, if I remember again, I think it should not be above $10 million, literally, $10 million. And $10 million, when you take the AMISOM budget is $600 million from the US, from the UN, but delivered directly by the UN. It's $350 million from the EU, a bit of support from other partners. It's over $1 billion. $1 billion means literally about $100 million a month. Am I correct? So that takes you to $3 to $4 million a day. So the AU Peace Fund is 3 days of AMISOM, if that can give you an indication. Now, the second aspect of the Peace Fund, it is said that you have the mandatory transfer from the EU budget, which is paid to the Peace Fund, and it does not mean that the whole amount would be paid, because it depends on how much member states have paid under the regular budget. So the amount really changes from year to year. Second, you have contributions that can be made by member states, individuals, and whoever else is willing to contribute, both from within and outside Africa. And that is the overwhelming part of the EU Peace Fund. It's literally 90, 95, 97, 98%, literally, of the EU. If you include the peace operations, 95, 97% of the Peace Fund is provided for by external partners of the EU. So this is how the Peace Fund was conceived. And now the whole challenge, in line with the stated desire of ownership and African leadership, is to shift the dynamics to get more funding from within Africa to the extent possible, while still mobilizing sufficient funding from external partners, in particular the UN, in view of its primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. So this is, I think, but colleagues from the EU can supplement me, but that's what I wanted to say about the Peace Fund. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And we see how expert the audience is when we get into the technicalities and everybody's still keeping on. Actually, Cedric, we've been intimately involved with the UN Peacebuilding Fund. Maybe you can add on that front, and you'll have the final word as well, as we are just over time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, I just wanted to respond to the excellent question of Professor Susan Woodward, because I think actually we recall that in the HIPPO there was a recommendation to create a single peace account. And that is really what the Peace Fund, I think, was meant to be when it was articulated in the Peace and Security Protocol. So the fund, the nomenclature fund is perhaps confusing. In that sense, it's very different from the peace-building fund. So in the UN context, if you were to think of the AU Peace Fund, it would be a combination of those elements of the regular budget that fund things like special political missions, special envoys, regional offices, as well as the assessed contribution budget of peacekeeping, as well as some of the elements of voluntary contribution of the peacebuilding fund, all together in one peace account. That's, I think, what was originally envisaged with the Peace Fund in the way it was articulated in the protocol, at least. And so we'll see where it goes now. So maybe my concluding remark, Arthur, would be that I think our topic of today's session, consolidating the AU-UN strategic partnership for an effective international peace and security architecture, is really critical to what we envisaged, also in the book where we started, about the future of African peace operations. I think if we can get this right, and I think we have a lot of confidence in Dr. Kabaruka to help us along the way, but if we can address the financing aspect, I think we would have really created a lot of momentum to achieve our objectives when it comes to the future of African peace operations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cedric, and thank you to the audience for sticking around until this time. And thank you. I don't think we could think of a better panel to discuss this issue. So please join me and thank this magnificent panel.